man, just piggybacking off of what Pops just said, but you know, the thing about leading worship is you begin to realize very quickly the limitations of yourself. And it's so interesting to me how oftentimes people will say, oh wow, that was a really great worship set. And I almost always want to say, well, that's because there was faith in the room. And you know, the reality is the same person can get up. I've led worship in various contexts, and it's the same me. I don't do anything different. I don't play the piano better or worse, mostly worse. And yet sometimes the Spirit of God just does the most remarkable things. And I just want to tell you, it's when there's faith in the room. When people come ready to worship, that's when things are different. That's when things change. And I want to kind of speak actually a little bit about that today, but I just wanted to say it on the outset. Worship is different, not because now there's, you know, Evan and Sandy, you know, get up and they're amazing and they're capable, and yes, they are, and God has anointed them to that. But they could get up in a room with no faith and it would be like crickets. And just as an encouragement to you, this space dictates so often what worship is like. So, yeah, I want to talk about worship today. It's something I'm involved in. It's something I'm passionate about. I'll turn on my timer before I get lost in this. And I have, however, felt over the last few years such, all I can describe it as is a quickening or an urgency within me when it comes to the practice of worship, particularly in corporate or public settings, in all of its shapes and forms, and I want to kind of dive into that a little bit. But I feel like we need to better understand what it is the Spirit does in us through the public space of worship, through something as simple as singing a song. What is happening inside of us? And I think, unfortunately, kind of coming out of maybe charismatic movements or alternative church stories, I think this pendulum of worship swings between worship as the 3 songs before the main event, or we kind of just generically broad stroke it, worship is your whole life. One is reductionary, one is generic and vague. And I think what ends up happening is our people get caught in the space between, and they actually have no idea why we do this thing called worship. And so I want to lean into this space this morning and hopefully reignite in us, or maybe just reinforce what you've been feeling, that worship is absolutely necessary and vital to the Christian life, but it is something that has to be cultivated. It is something that we have to educate people in. And instead of kind of starting at the end, what should it look like? What I'd like to do is I think firstly we have to recognize the cultural realities that make worship very challenging for our people. Because I think it is challenging. I think for the modern world, worship poses a problem. And so I want to sit there for a little bit, and then secondly, I want to talk about what are the practices that offer a different way. So if there are spirits, and I think there are in our culture that are directly in opposition to worship, how do we, in our public spaces, am I too loud? It's popping. It's okay?
They're just going to
check it out. Okay. I'm pretty loud. And so then secondly, what are the things that we can cultivate in our communities that push back against the tides of secularism and individualism that are so present in our world today? And so, does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. So, first in this kind of cultural space that we find ourselves, and this comes as no surprise, but we live in, I want to say, the age of entertainment. Not a age, the age. That is what is our present reality. So everything from the obvious, the kind of binge watch of Netflix, right? The access we have. But when we think about Twitter, Instagram, the news, politics, let's be real, it's all entertainment. And what we love about entertainment is that we can feel all the thrill of whatever it is we're being entertained by, but we don't have to do anything. I can enjoy this sort of adventure of something from the safety of my couch. There's a book by author Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death. He wrote it, 30-something years ago. Read it, it's amazing. It's so prophetic about where we find ourselves. But he says this, so this is pre-iPhone, okay? He says, most of our daily media, news, TV, etc., is inert. consisting of information that gives us something to talk about, but cannot lead to any meaningful action. That's why we like it. All the rush, all the thrill, no cost, no action. So I can listen to a political debate. This is kind of the millennial scenario, right? They're all fired up about politics, but nobody votes. What is that, right? Or if you're like me, you can get really into Extraordinary Homes on Netflix. Anybody? It's amazing. These like beautiful, like designed, gorgeous homes. And I'm sitting watching it while my kitchen is an absolute mess. What is that? Entertainment versus action. Or I can show up at church on a Sunday and I can sing songs about the glory and honor of God. And I can listen to a message about forgiveness. Ooh, that's so good. I'm so glad He's forgiven me. And all the while I am nursing bitterness. And this is where we find ourselves in an entertainment economy. I consume and then I leave. And what happens is that distraction without involvement means I'm not invested. And if I'm not invested, then I don't have to care. And if I don't care, then I can go on judging and be cynical about whatever it is that's entertaining me at that moment, which leads to the second cultural reality that I want to speak about this morning, because in addition to an age of entertainment, we live under a spirit of skepticism. It is pervasive in our culture. It is like no one wants to be the tallest blade of grass. You know that saying? That's a thing, right? A spirit of skepticism. Dallas Willard writes that for centuries our culture has cultivated the idea that the skeptical person is always smarter than the one who believes. And this is just as much true out in the world as it is in our churches. What's interesting about this spirit is it starts so young. All you have to do is stand on a playground and watch kids interact with each other. Right? Whoever wants to be cool, something about individualism married with our insecurities creates this cynicism and this skepticism within us from our infancy. It's like, it's the lowest common denominator. I don't have to believe anything, I just have to belittle what you believe in. And that spirit comes into our churches, and there are other cultural realities, but I chose entertainment and skepticism because I believe they are in direct opposition to biblical worship, to spirit-filled praise, because both center around the self, as opposed to love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength. They are as far from that as you can imagine. And so we have the epicenter of worship here, heart, soul, mind, body, abandoned in praise, undignified, these sacrifices that we offer up. And then we have these irreconcilable spirits over here, entertainment, skepticism, consumption. I take what I want and then I leave. There's one of my absolute favorite books. If you haven't read it, Whatever Happened to Worship by Tozer. He wrote it decades ago, and it is, I feel like, even more true now than it was at the time. But as I was reading through it again, I came across this moment where I thought, wow, this is exactly what I feel like we're wrestling with in the church. And he says this: the church that can't be entertained, the church that can't worship, must be entertained. The church that can't worship must be entertained, and this is the scary part. To those of us, men and women, who can't lead their churches into worship, you are forced to provide the entertainment. Us. That's what we get up and do on Sunday if our people don't know how to worship. That is the alternative. And I think it is a beautiful and loving kind of wake-up call, a slap in the face. If we don't know how to teach our people to enter into intimacy, to communion with God, the only alternative we have is to put on a nice show. And I don't know about you, but I have no interest in that. But I'll tell you something, it's easier to do that. I love what Brad said yesterday. It is safer to put on a show. I can control everything. I can do this song into this song. I don't have to listen to the Spirit. I don't have to step out. I don't have to sing prophetically. I don't have to speak words of truth when I can just sort of do my thing. I come, I watch, I leave. And friends, can I say with all passion but kindness, we stand at a crossroads. Will we be churches filled with people who know how to worship, not just mind, not just emotions, but body, but everything that we have to give, or our other option is better programs, bigger speakers, brighter lights, better bands, all of which cover up a deep inability to engage intimately and personally with the Spirit of God. And you know what scares me about that the most? I think we can get by on a Sunday. People will still come. Oh wow, the vibe was so cool, the worship leader was so great, I was so inspired, whatever that means. But this is what scares me. They'll walk away and they will have no idea how to engage with the presence of God on Monday, or Tuesday, or Wednesday. And so we put on this great show, but our people are deeply unable to commune with the Spirit of God. And I think we are charged with the necessity of learning how to lead our people into the practice and the discipline of praise. How do we cultivate that? Worship in all its forms, not just the 3 songs, but hymns, praise, prayer, prophecy, listening, private and public. And I'm so passionate about this because on the kind of the spirit of this age, ever pushing in is the denials of secularism and cynicism. It doesn't matter, doesn't mean anything, just to each his own, right? Everyone does as they see fit. Just enjoy, just be entertained, hide the brokenness, hide the sin, cover the insecurity, show up once a week, and then just go on and do as you see fit. And the longer that narrative circles, entertainment, cynicism, skepticism, secularism, the longer that circles, the easier it is for our worship to be misappropriated from the thing it was intended for. And then we find we have a community of people who don't know who they are, who don't know why they were created, who live in deep insecurity. And I look at it and I think it's Romans 1. They exchanged everything about, let me actually read that really quick. Romans 1:25. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal powers, his divine nature have been clearly seen and been understood, so that men are without excuse. But it says this, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him nor gave thanks to him, but in their thinking they became futile, and the foolishness of their hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images that looked like man and birds and animals and reptiles. Verse 25, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. This is what we are fighting for. This is what we are pushing against. This is what worship reorients us towards. And I feel like the call for us as leaders, as pastors, as people involved in local church, is that we need to say, like David in Psalms 91, every single Sunday morning, come and worship and bow down. Come and kneel before the Lord your Maker. For he is your God, and you are the people of his pasture. That is who you are. That is what you were made for. Come experience the reality that is in him. Come and know who made you. Come and know that you are a worshiping being. That is the responsibility that rests on us as leaders. We are worshiping beings. We are made for it. We are designed towards it. We can't help giving it away. And if we don't help our people direct that towards the one true living God, they will direct it towards something else. When Jesus speaks about worship in John 4, spirit and truth, I think so often we have this idea that that's just going to happen. And I don't think it does. It has to be cultivated. Truth has to be taught. A recognition of the Spirit has to grow within us. And I think as leaders, we have the responsibility of cultivating and empowering that both in ourselves and in our communities. Now, I see this happening in 2 ways. Not the only 2 ways, but I just want to speak about, if we're talking about entertainment, the age of entertainment, the spirit of skepticism. Firstly, true worship allows us to experience reality. This is what I mean by that. Actually, one of the scholars I was reading, I forget who it was, but he spoke about praise as an adventure into reality. It's like everything that's behind us is false. False gods, false things. Everything in front of us is the reality of what truly exists. When we gather in a community, not just on our own, when we gather, public worship, we come together as a body to honor and praise God, whether that be in songs, prophecies, singing, listening. And when we do this, we are partaking in the new creation that is ours through the resurrection of Jesus and through the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. That's what happens. We stand once again like Adam and Eve in the garden, community with each other, community with God, and public worship becomes the glimpse, the foretaste, in a sense, of what we are living in, but also what is to come in its absolute fullness, the divine and the human need. Think about John in the book of Revelations. He talks about not just the future reality, but the eternal reality that is happening right now. The seraphim and the cherubs and all the creatures and all the angels singing, holy, holy, holy. That is the eternal reality right now. And when I come into worship and I sing holy, 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 suddenly the temporal world in which I live is communing with the eternal world. And the reality of what God always intended is colliding in this beautiful, powerful moment. That's what happened this morning. The eternal song meeting the earthly one. It's the moment we experience what is actually real, not everything else. And T. Wright speaks about worship, public worship again. I'm specifically talking about when we gather, public worship as the signs and the means of the new creation. He says public worship is the Christian version of the cloud by day and the fire by night. It's this symbol, if you will, that the presence of the covenant God has come to dwell amongst his people. That's what worship is. And so when I sing, my praise becomes the means of both demonstrating, but also anticipating the fullness of the new creation. And I begin to glimpse what it will be like, and my mind and my soul and my body are being remade by the reality that I am entering into. And that is true in my mind, my theology. It is true in my spirit. But friends, it is also true in my body. Think about this for a second, because I think far too often we talk about physical worship as cultural, and it isn't, okay? My body, when I sing, okay, think about it, like, music does something to us, right? We all know this, okay? But when I sing worship, okay, something about my very flesh and blood, something in here, becomes a chamber that is filled with adoration. It's not just my mind, it's not just my emotions. In the physical act of singing, something is taking place in here, where my body begins to participate in a way that it had not before. And I know it sounds weird, but I think it is true. When my soul communes with God and my body follows, isn't it curious how the Bible speaks about worship in physical terms? It's not just what we think or what we feel, it's what we do. The Hebrew word, the root of the Hebrew word for worship means to prostrate. Literally, that's the word, to bow down. The word for bless comes from to kneel. The word for thanksgiving defines itself as the extension of hands. That's what it means in the Hebrews. And so when we talk about worship and blessing and thanksgiving, we're not just talking about the idea of, there are corresponding actions innate to the very words themselves. Yeah. Because friends, we have to experience the reality of who God is, not just in our minds, not just in our emotions, but in our physical bodies as well. If we talk about pushing back the tides of entertainment, nothing does that like sacrificial worship. Nothing does that like me engaging, me setting aside the people to my right or to my left, and me jumping for joy, me lying down on my face in worship, because God is worthy of not just my mind, not just my emotions, but my body as well. And practically, this is such a great way to cultivate worship in our communities. Teaching people how to worship with their bodies. Something happens in that physical demonstration. Can you imagine And it's so funny because it's so not true in the physical world, but some reason we think about it like this in the spiritual world. Can you imagine if my husband said to me, I love you with my mind and my emotions, but not with my body? Like, I'm not like that. I'm not going to kiss you, I'm going to sleep in a separate bed, I'm never going to hug you or anything. Like, how strange would that be? And yet we do that with God. God, you're worthy of my mind and my emotions, but I'm just not the type of person that likes to raise my hands. I don't want to get down on my knees. It's strange. And yet so many people live there. And I've led in churches where week after week I see the same people just standing passively. And I don't know what else to call that but entertainment. One last thing before we move on. To those of you who are pastors and leaders in your community, you know it's hard as a worship leader to demonstrate this, right? You've got a guitar, a mic, a keyboard, whatever it is. It's not hard for you to demonstrate, right? You don't have anything in your hands. You can get down on your knees. You can raise your hands. You can lie down in the presence of God, and you can show to your people what it means to give a sacrifice of praise. And this is one more thing, and then I'll move on, I promise, but I think we've compartmentalized our services, where it's sort of like the worship pastor gets up and does their thing, and the teaching pastor is getting coffee in the back, or off to the side, or sitting there thinking about their message, just disengaged. And I think, friends, when we do that, we abdicate the role of worship leader, which is not just this person, it's this person, or this person. You lead your people into worship. And I've seen it time and time again. If the elders or the leaders know how to worship, so go the people. But if they don't, so go the people. And you wonder why you have passive congregations who just stand there, sing a line or two, come, consume, go home. I think we have to recognize that leaders that it starts here. Can I offer a sacrifice of praise? Okay, moving on. If experience is the antidote to entertainment, then can I pose that the antidote against the spirit of skepticism is holy expectancy? I was listening to a lecture series at a college recently on the temple and the kind of narrative arc of the temple in Scripture. And if I had time, I kind of would love to unpack it because it was so interesting. But super briefly, okay, so Genesis 1 and 2, right? The temple analogy, heaven and earth, Adam and Eve in communion with God, the image bearers, right? Then we have the fall. Then Exodus 40 picks up and we have the building of the tabernacle, right? It's the sign of the covenant, it's the sign of what is to come. Only this time, it's only Aaron and his sons who have access to the Holy of Holies. It's not like Eden, where it's Adam and Eve communing with God. Now it's just the priests. But interestingly, in Ephesians 1 and 2, Paul picks up this narrative again. Only this time, what does he say? He said, but God has united all things together, Jew and Gentile, and now, he says, together as one body, you are the new temple. That which God dwells by his Spirit. And I think sometimes we can miss the significance of this, the rebuilding of the temple, the mystery of that kind of worship space getting lost in us. The reality that the Spirit, who once was only accessible by the priests, has now been made accessible to every single one of us, has now been poured out not just to Aaron and his descendants, but to you and I, a royal priesthood, a holy people, set apart to bear his image. And I found this so striking as I was preparing to talk on worship, because I think this is where it begins. This understanding, the Spirit has come to dwell in us. If we want to create cultures of holy expectancy, we start there. The Spirit of God, that which was longed for thousands of years, has now been made known to you. That God would dwell with us, and because he dwells with us, anything can happen. Yeah. Think about Moses when he enters the tabernacle. He knows there's expectancy. God is going to speak to me. This is where God dwells. And as I thought about that and thought about the book of Acts, you have this kind of group of early Jewish believers who would have lived their entire lives being separated from the Holy of Holies. every week coming to the temple and knowing that they couldn't access God on their own. And suddenly the curtain is torn, and you better believe that that was not just symbolic for them. That was the reality that the thing they had waited for was suddenly happening. That like the prophet Joel said, the Spirit of God was poured out on all men. Imagine that. That which was always forbidden now being made known, and you better believe they expected something to happen. You better believe that when they gathered together, they might have been a little bit terrified, but they knew that the presence of God could do radical things. Can you imagine that? I'm going to hear the voice of God for the first time. And friends, I felt this. I think we've lost this. The knowledge of the holy. The knowledge of the sacred. And I'm not emotional normally. The knowledge that when we come together, the Spirit of God is here and He wants to do things. This is what they waited for. This is what they longed for, that they could be in communion with God, not just the priest, but every single man, woman, and child, dreaming dreams, prophesying, engaging in worship and hymns and songs of praise. But I think it begs the question, what does the average person walking into our service think? What do they think is going to happen? What do I think is going to happen? As a worship leader, do I just kind of get into the motions? I pick the songs that I know get the people going. Honest. Oh, this one's a favorite. It seems to do something. And hear me, there are holy moments, but there are also lazy entertainment, consumer moments. Yeah. I think we have to cultivate awe and expectation and wonder again. The Spirit of God is here. When I worship, this is the sign of the new creation. This is the sign of a covenant God dwelling amongst me. Do we allow people to dictate what happens, or do we allow the presence of God? Do I give Him space and time? I don't think we even have to have crazy long services. But do we have the space within us? Are we willing to risk? Do we have to go one song to the next because our congregations don't know what to do in a moment of silence? Because they don't know how to listen? Because they don't know how to engage personally? They don't know how to adore Him without prompting? They don't know how to be with Him without direction? Do our people know how to be in the presence of God, unhurried, unrushed, just enjoying? When we walk into the room, do we think, God, what are you going to do today? What words of prophecy are here? What songs of liberation are here? What psalms of exaltation are here? Think about 1 Corinthians 14. Such a kind of complicated thing on worship. But the part so often I can miss over is that the fact that Paul says so sort of seemingly ordinary, like obviously everyone came with a hymn and a word, right? Like he just sort of walks past that, like everyone comes with it. And the problem is not that people are coming to consume, the problem is that like it's getting a little crazy because everyone's coming with something. And I think somewhere between 1 Corinthians 14 and where we find ourselves, we've lost that. Yeah. And can I be bold enough to say, I think we risk drifting back into the temple of Aaron, where I can control the Holy of Holies, and I just sort of mediate. And our people come every day, and they expect something of me, and then they leave, but they have a deep inability to worship and commune with the Spirit of God on their own. And friends, we have to change that. The temple is more comfortable for us. We can control it, but it is not the new creation. Holy expectancy, what is God going to do? Push back the tides of entertainment with expectation and engagement, cultivate that in our people, and then we combat secularism and cynicism and skepticism with the knowledge of the holy and the wonder of God. And as people come in expectantly, you can begin to hear the voice of the Holy Spirit because people are listening. Let's not grieve him into silence by sort of creating this space that we like and we can do what needs to be done, but we just become at best priestly entertainers. And at worst, I think we grieve him deeply. All right, now, I did want to kind of just speak for a few moments. I'm trying to be on my 30, but experience and expectation, this thing that we need to cultivate, just a few practical ways in our public worship. I wanted this to kind of be some stuff that we can take home and process and wrestle with our communities. And so I do want to say, firstly, friends, this requires teaching. I was processing this with my husband, and he akined worship to like giving someone car keys and expecting them to know how to drive. Because all around us, there's cars on the road, right? People come to church, they know that there's going to be worship, and we just assume that they know what they're going to do. The problem is, it's like week 1, week 2, week 3 come back, and it's like people don't know what they're doing. And then years go by, and you come back, and the person is still sitting in a parked car with the keys. And I think, friends, we've done such a disservice by assuming that people know what worship is. I don't think we do. Even in preparing and mulling over this, I felt God open my mind to new possibilities about what worship can do in me. And I think we need to take time to teach on this. You know, I was speaking with friends and in different churches and different communities and just kind of, why do people worship? Why don't they worship? You know, just asking. And what shocked me is almost no one I spoke to had heard messages on worship. No one. They've heard on like your life is worship, but not on the practice of praise. No one. That is staggering to me, because it is something that was present from the beginning and will be present through all eternity, and we don't think it's worth talking about. We have to teach on it, and it doesn't even, I think doing a series would be great, but I think I loved when Evan was leading this morning. I thought, what a great example. He spoke about hands raised. What are we doing? Hands bowed down. And I thought, that's a teaching moment. That's helping people connect what we do. If you're not musical or you don't like worship, like, you know, on a purely practical level, why should I engage? Why shouldn't I just get a coffee and come in a little bit late? It's not that it's sacred. It's not that it's holy. Or is it? And I think in a way, friends, we've just become all too familiar with this idea of, yeah, God with us. And can I beg us to reconsider? Can I beg us to cultivate something else in our people? So let's teach on it. In moments of worship, why do we raise our hands? What are the forms of worship we see in the Bible? Take little cameos on a Sunday and massage this truth into your people. Second practical thing, this requires partnership between the leaders and your worship leaders and your team. This needs to be all together. I was sitting with a worship pastor recently, and they were just kind of wrestling with their community and the disengagement, and really kind of trying to get the pastors and the elders involved in like, hey, I think this is something that's not a problem in our community. And I realized, you know, most pastors sit here. So when I'm leading worship, I see this. They don't. They don't see the hundreds of people that are standing there like this every Sunday. And honestly, I've led worship in churches where I'm afraid to open my eyes, because invariably I open my eyes and there's just someone standing like this. Right? A pastor doesn't see that on a Sunday. And one of the things my dad has always done for years is you'll find him standing over there so he can see. So he knows, hey, this is something that people don't get. And can I encourage you, pastors, to be aware? Where are your churches actually at? Because you stand here, you have the benefit of the full band, the few people who are singing behind you, but you have no idea whether or not your people are actually engaging with the presence of God. And it isn't just physical stuff, but guys, we know when there's faith in there. We know. So let's be honest about that, and then let's partner together, pastors, leaders, worship leaders, bands. Let's partner together in cultivating something else. Another point, don't feel obliged to have a big band. I said it earlier, but nothing covers up passivity like drums and bass. Honestly. You know what I mean? But this morning, if you think about it, like one guy on a guitar, if people weren't worshiping, we would know, right? And I think so often it's just easier, and I know as a leader, I love having a big band. But I've been in seasons where the community restricted down to one guitar, and I'm talking 400 people and a guitar. I was thinking, early Glenridge days, my dad and I were talking this morning, they had a couple hundred people and they had no worship leader. They just had a mic at the front. Ephesians 14, 1 Corinthians 14, and they just waited. If you've ever heard Mike Pilavachi and Matt Redman talk about early days of their church and feeling like they just kind of got to this rut. And Mike, being a prophetic pastor, just thought, no, I'm not going to let that slide. I'm not just going to kind of keep showing up with the people that don't know how to worship. And you think if Matt Redman is leading worship there, like surely they could kind of pull it off. And they tell the story of saying, okay, we're not going to do this. And they literally like didn't have a band for, I think it was like a couple months. Correct me if any of you know this story. What?
6 months.
6 months, okay? No band on a Sunday. And they would gather around in a circle. Talk about an unsafe space, right? Like, talk about the Spirit leading us into unsafe places, okay? Believe in worship enough to strip everything back. Mike said people would stop showing up on a Sunday. But slowly they began to cultivate a spirit of worship that wasn't dependent on a band, that wasn't dependent on a dynamic leader, that was dependent on each individual arriving with holy expectancy. God, what are you going to do today? And out of that season, that kind of famous song, when the music fades and all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing just to bring something that's of worth that will bless your heart. I'll bring you more than a song, because a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within than the way things appear. I'm coming back to the heart of worship when it's all about you. And I'm okay with discomfort, and I'm okay with a little bit silence, because at the end of the day, I want to offer something that is worthy to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So let's be willing to risk. Those are crazy moves, but friends, he is worthy of extravagant worship, and it requires something of us as leaders. Finally, don't just limit worship to scripted song. And I'm not just meaning like it's either a scripted song or it's a prophetic song. We see the reading of Psalms. If your church isn't kind of prophetically ready, or your leaders aren't yet, what about Psalms being read out? What about creating expectancy by after a worship service saying, hey, did God do anything in the worship this morning? What did he do? How did he speak to you? Do we have room for prophecy? Do we have a vision of how to begin to stir up the Spirit of God in people? Where they walk in with the genuine anticipation, God, what are you going to do today? And that is both for you as leaders. How do you empower your worship leaders to be okay in that space? But I think it also requires that we tell our people to be okay in that space. Hey, we're going to take a moment in silence, and it's going to be difficult. But I want you to ask the Spirit of God to speak to you. He's here, he's with you, he's indwelling in you. The thing that people long for, the Spirit of God has been poured out. Let the Spirit of God speak. Let's be willing to risk, trusting in the good Spirit to lead us into unsafe places. Can I pray for us? I just think he is so remarkable. He is so wonderful. He is so worthy of so much more than just my worship. But I have that to give. I have my mind, I have my body, I have my spirit. And Lord, I want to arrive one day at the end of my life knowing that I didn't hold back a single ounce of praise and adoration. God, won't you forgive where safety and comfort have just caused us to drift into entertainment? It's so easy, and I don't think it comes from bad hearts. It's just, we just slip in there. God, won't you forgive our need to control, A fear that if we take a risk, people will leave. That if we prophesy, people won't want to be involved. That we might look weird or whatever, God. We want your Spirit to lead us. We want to know your voice. I want to ask right now for a quickening within the men and women in this room, Lord, that you would begin to speak in new ways, that you would begin to give them words and visions and insights, not just on a big level, but specifically for their communities. You have called them to lead them. You have called them to pastor them. And so, Lord, I ask that you would give them insight into how do I cultivate true public worship and praise in the hearts and minds of my people so that they go out knowing how to enter into his presence with adoration. Give us eyes to see the sacred and the holy